Everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at pleasure-based theories of desire. We're going to look at Galen Strawson's view on pleasure-based theories of desire, in particular the one from his book Mental Reality, and it's the chapter called The Weather Watchers. So Strawson is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he tends to work in philosophy of mind and areas like that. So let's go ahead and jump into the pleasure-based theories, and then we'll start looking at his. A pleasure-based theory, there's a variety of pleasure-based theories. But typically you can think of them like this. So for an organism to want P is for that organism to be disposed to take pleasure in its seeming that P and displeasure in its seeming that not P. Here you see that the desire for something is intimately related to taking pleasure in it. So if it seems to me that I am getting my coffee, then I am disposed, taking pleasure in it, seeming that I'm getting my coffee. I'll be excited about it, those types of things. And this is the pleasure-based theory, and this you can see why this makes sense. It seems that if we're conscious of our desires, we're conscious of our current desires, of course. I'm going to be satisfied when my desire is fulfilled, and part of that satisfaction is the experience of pleasure. The satisfaction is that desire actually is fulfilled, so that's one use of the word satisfaction. The other connotation of that is a sense of pleasurable sensation that we have when our desire is fulfilled. And so if I am disposed to take pleasure in it seeming that P, displeasure in seeming that not P, then that is all there is to there being a desire for P. Strawson starts out his chapter when considering the weather watchers, and you can see his position to be directly pointed at and against the motivational theories of desire. So you can see this connection to our last section on motivational theories of desire. So here he says weather watchers. The weather watchers are a race of sentient, intelligent creatures. They're distributed about the surface of our planet, rooted on the ground, profoundly interested in local weather. They have sensations, thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and desires. They possess a conception of an objective spatial world, but they are constitutionally incapable of any sort of behavior as this is ordinarily understood. They lack the necessary physiology. Their mental lives have no other observable effect, and they are not even disposed to behave in any particular way. So it's important to imagine these people. They're unable to behave. They're not in control of their thought processes, and they have sensations and beliefs and desires. So when we consider the dispositional thesis, and connect it to the weather watchers, we'd have to conclude that the weather watchers don't have any mental states, because the dispositional thesis states it's impossible for there to be a being that has mental properties but is not disposed to behave in any way. And so this would be something similar to Eckhart and Doring's view, though they wouldn't say it's just this large-scale behavior. They'd want to also connect it to maybe thought behaviors in terms of thoughts or actions in that respect too. But the dispositional thesis that you would see maybe in someone else's view would be that acting is necessary, or being disposed to act at least is a necessary condition for being a mental being. So it's impossible for there to be a being that has mental properties but is not even disposed to act in any particular way. Being disposed to act is a necessary condition of being a mental being. The weather watchers then may or may not have a conception of action, and if they do, then they just act, but they don't know what they would do if they could act, and if they have no conception of action, then this is not part of their conceptual repertoire. This introduces the rooting story. He says it's possible that they could have devolved or evolved from beings that were able to act and things like that to beings that eventually were fixed to the ground, losing their ability to for automation, so they were unable to move themselves and different things like that. So he has this called the rooting story. But regardless of that, he asks the question, would the weather watchers want something not to happen without wanting to do something? So there's this idea that if I want something, then I have to want to do something about it. But Strawson thinks this isn't true. He says it's not the case that if one wants something not to happen, then then that person wishes that he could stop it from happening. And he says that might be the case, that it's hard for us to understand this, but that's only because we are deeply habituated to action and action thinking. So we're acting beings. Um, and it's not part of the essence of desiring that something should have to happen, or that if you don't want something to happen, that you think that you need to do something about it, or that you're disposed to do acting as to bring it about that it doesn't happen. And so he thinks that it's not the case that action is required for desiring. It's not part of the essence of desiring. The reason why we think it's really important or essential is because we are action-oriented beings, and we live in a world in which, our actions are prevalent. We're always acting, we're always doing things, we're always interacting with the world. But weather watchers are a lot different than us. They're constitutionally incapable of action, and they don't even have the conception of intentional action. So if there are beings that lack the conception of intentionally acting, and they're constitutionally incapable of acting, it seems as if then the dispositional thesis would have to say that they can't have desires. But is it possible for the weather watchers to have desires? And it seems like it is. They can want the weather to be a particular way, but not be disposed to do anything about it because they're constitutionally incapable of this sort of thing, and they don't have the conception of intentional. So how does the watcher's mind work? Well, their mind works quite similarly to the way ours do. They have sensory experiences. These give rise to beliefs and desires and wonderings and doubts and emotions and things like this. They have newly formed beliefs, and these connect with their other beliefs they've already established. These can be entailed to produce further, these can entail other beliefs, creating new beliefs, producing further hopes and desires and fears and things like this. You have thoughts which can give rise to other thoughts, and existing beliefs determine general character of what happens when a weather watcher is puzzling over some sort of problem or something. So they can have a narrative about their life. They can have general conceptions, spatial conceptions. They can their general thoughts narrate their thoughts and their beliefs and desires and emotions narrate their life in a way that frames their questioning and different things like this. So their mind works in relatively similar ways to ours. The weather watchers have many mental activity dispositions. So, for example, emotional reaction dispositions, desire forming dispositions, train of thought dispositions, automatic sensory experiences, interpretations, and things like this. But none of this mental going on are intentionally undertaken. So none of this type of thing is intentional. It just happens to them. So, but if you do consider your own train of thought, it seems as if most of your mental activity aren't related to or aren't produced by you in an active way, in a conscious way. It just kind of happens, right? When you're thinking through a problem, the beliefs is kind of you find yourself with the belief. It's not like you did anything consciously to make yourself believe a particular thing. And this is also the same with weather watchers. Another thing about the weather watchers is that while they do have desire forming dispositions and belief forming dispositions and things like this, it's not as if these dispositions can give rise to any sort of action or behavior as ordinarily understood. Seems as if though that the weather watchers are possible, right? It seems that you could have this sort of mental life without being disposed to act in any particular way. And because of this, that it doesn't seem to be as necessary as a dispositional thesis says it is. That is, action doesn't seem to be as necessary as a dispositional thesis seems to indicate. It appears you can have sensations and emotions and desires and beliefs and things like this without being disposed to behaving in a particular way in the external world. So the dispositional thesis is expanded to be more connected directly to desires and beliefs. And the way it's characterized here is to possess desires and beliefs is necessarily to be disposed to act or behave in certain ways, even if one never in fact acts in any way at all, whether because one is paralyzed or because one is naturally or constitutionally capable of action or behavior. But nonetheless, one is disposed to act. That's the key part of the expanded dispositional thesis. The connection between desire and behavior is such is of such a kind that one can't really say what a desire is without talking about behavior and dispositions to behavior. So this is the expanded version of the dispositional thesis. Strawson then starts to move into presenting his opinion, his position, and then defending it. So he says, it doesn't seem to be the case, seem to be true that if we cannot make sense of the notion of desire independently of the notion of action or behavior, or the notion of wanting to do something, it seems to be the case that you can make sense of desire independently of the notion of action or behavior. The essential aspect of desire for him is just the wanting or liking something. It's wanting something or wanting something to be the case. So it's not, so the part desire is just this wanting or this liking. It's not so much, it doesn't seem to be essentially connected to being disposed to action or those types of things, wanting to do something. So you have this distinction between wanting and doing, right? So I can want something without doing something. I can want something without wanting to do something about it. And if I want something or I want something to be the case, this doesn't necessarily involve being disposed to act in any particular way. And so here's when you start to get to closer to Strawson's position. He says, no doubt, to want something is to be disposed to feel satisfied or pleased or happy or contented when you get it. So if you want something, and then you're going to be disposed to having pleasure, pleased when you get that type of thing. And if you don't get it, then you're going to be frustrated. Right? That's the idea. But it doesn't follow that if you want something is necessarily to want to do something about getting it. You can want something without wanting to do something to get it. And so what Strawson is trying to do is he's trying to say, look, action might be really highly related to desire. Our desires might enable us to act in lots of honor beliefs, but action isn't necessary for desire. Desire has its own intrinsic structure and is related more to being disposed to feeling satisfied or pleased should your desire be fulfilled. More than just lacking a disposition to do something, you don't even have to have the conception of the possibility to be able to do anything to want something, according to Strawson. So, for example, babies and non-human animals might be good examples of this, right? So, an infant might want something, but doesn't have any conception of the possibility of being able to do something about getting it. And the same thing is probably true of some non-human animals. Um, and so this would show then that you can want something without having any conception of the possibility of being able to get it, right? You don't know how to go about doing it. So you can lack some language-like concept structures, And you can have the language like concept structures, and you can also lack or have the possibility of understanding how to get at the thing. And so you can see how, having thoughts, having language like structure doesn't really necessarily help you to identify wanting a particular thing or not wanting a particular thing. And so having a rational thought process seems to be independent of your desire for something. It's not the case that I need to have a conception of being able to get what I want in order to want it. I Wanting something is different than wanting to do something. If I want to do something, then I'm going to have some sort of basic conception about going about doing it. But if I just want something in particular, it doesn't entail that I need to have a conception about how to bring that about. So Strawson then claims that wanting or liking is essentially linked to the disposition to be pleased or satisfied in particular circumstances, and it has nothing necessarily to do with your action or behavior. They also don't involve the will either. So desire, wanting, some longing, approval don't necessarily involve notions of control over the will either. It could be objected to Strawson that you're still disposed to act even if you never act in any way or don't even conceive of yourself acting in a way. So the disposition to act is still there. So if I desire that pee or desire to get a cup of coffee, or if I desire coffee or something, I'm still disposed to act. But this disposition may not be, you might not be aware of it. So the disposition to act doesn't entail having a conception of acting. And it also doesn't entail actually acting. It just entails being disposed to act. And so it might be the case that if I want something, I'm disposed to act, even though I may never act in any particular way. So there's a sense in which this is true, um, but it same time doesn't follow that the weather watchers are disposed to act or behave in any way. Um, and he says 2 points can be raised by this phrase. One is operate in certain ways. Should certain conditions be fulfilled? And so this is really important for him. So you're going to consider a conditional statement, and the first part of it has to do with certain conditions being fulfilled. And he wants to pick this apart here. He wants to talk about um, what it means to operate and what the conditions are. So let's go ahead and look at that. So this is the first. The first is that there is indeed a sense in which a weather watcher is set to operate in certain ways, in certain conditions, and having certain desires that it has. Thus, if it likes rain to fall in circumstance C, it is set to come to hope that it will rain when it believes that circumstance C is obtained, and it feels pleased if it does rain. So, so this is true of the weather watchers. If it wants something like X and it comes to believe that Y's lead to X, then it's going to be disposed to hope for a Y, right? So it wants its wants interact with its beliefs. So this is important. So this connection between wants and beliefs in Strawson's theory is really important. Desires relate to your beliefs, and this is going to open the door to different types of connections that we will see with the other theories. So it might be the case that the motivational theory has intuitive support because our beliefs and our desires together will enable us to see how to bring about getting what we want. And so our wants, they interact with our beliefs and they have particular cause and effects, right? So Strawson was claiming that having desires or preferences, when they're combined with beliefs, will interact with other types of mental states, but none of this is involved action necessarily. None of it even makes a disposition to act inevitable either. And so it seems that a weather watcher might be disposed to forming other types of mental states, like belief, like hopes and things like that. But it's not as if it's disposed to behave in any particular way. In having desires, the second point is the weather watchers are not really set to operate in certain ways should certain conditions be fulfilled. They are also set to act or behave in particular ways should certain conditions be fulfilled. Now, the question that Strawson stresses, and he stresses this pretty much for the rest of his chapter, is what are these conditions, right? These conditions can be lots of different things. And even if we are set to act or behave in when certain conditions fulfilled, it doesn't follow that that anyone is disposed to act or behave in a particular way at the moment, right? So now he starts to get into some interesting territory. He says it may sound implausible, but everything is set to act or behave in certain ways should certain conditions be fulfilled. So anything can act in a particular way should certain conditions be fulfilled. The table in front of me is set; it can is disposed to walk around, for example, should certain conditions be fulfilled. So an arrangement of the sum of particles, or something like that, or someone somehow animates the table or sets a machine to the table and enables it to walk around. You just have to put enough into the set of conditions that will enable it to behave or be disposed to behave. So it might be the case that a weather watcher is disposed to behave if certain conditions are fulfilled, but that doesn't really tell you anything about the essence of desire, right? It actually doesn't even tell you that um, that that what this disposition that it doesn't create an informative disposition, which is the idea. An informative disposition would be one that you actively have, and that if something happens to you, then you'll respond a particular way or you'll think a particular way. But anything is disposed almost to do anything, right, if a strange enough set of circumstances occurs. And so those are uninformative dispositions. Strawson says there are obvious limits on the sorts of things one can possibly mention as conditions when one claims that something is as it now is, currently disposed to act or behave in certain ways, should certain conditions be fulfilled. So then he has this argument he lays out here. He says, if I desire that X should occur, 2, I have the following two beliefs. A, I believe I can bring about Y by phi if circumstances C obtain. I believe that if Z occurs, X will occur. If I were to bring about Y by phi, then Z would occur. 4, I have never thought about the fact stated in 3, if I were to bring about Y by phi, then Z would occur. But it is true of me now, given my internal state, that if I were to think about it, I would soon realize that it was true. That is, I would come to the conclusion that if I were to bring about Y by phi, Z would occur. And this might then, coupled with my belief, to make me see that I could bring about Y by phi. So he says 5. I have no objections to bringing about my X by phi. So this is a case. So this is a case where you could see how these things can interact. If I desire that something should occur, and I believe that Z will occur, that if Z occurs, then X will occur, and I can bring about Z by phi. So if I want to be awake, and that's my goal, and I believe that if I drink coffee, then I will be awake. Then if I were to drink coffee, I can drink coffee by purchasing coffee and putting it to my lips, and Z will occur. So if I were to bring about drinking coffee by buying and putting it to my lips and pouring it down my throat, then I would drink coffee, and this then coupled with my belief B2 to make me see that I can bring about X by phi. All right. So, so here you see that there's a lot that you want something here, but it's connected to lots of beliefs, right? So now we're combining desires and beliefs. Beliefs about how the world works, beliefs about um, how I can fulfill these desires and things like that. And also, this is combined with desires too. So he goes on and he says, if I had realized that I could bring about X by bringing about Z, by bringing about Y, by phi and C, I would be all set to phi on my forming the belief that C obtained. Phi and C would give me something I want. So C could be some sort of condition or something. Now, the idea is that there's a connection between there are beliefs and there are desires, and beliefs are different than desires. I can want something, draw some things without being disposed to acting to get it. I can want something without going to get it, and but nonetheless, when you combine certain sets of beliefs and certain sets of desires, then I can know how to get it, and I could be disposed to wanting to do something about getting it. But this is not desiring by itself, right? This is combining desires and beliefs. The case that you just haven't put all this set of circumstances together, so you haven't thought from 1 to 5, right? Um, and so the question is then, given that is so, is there any sense in which I am now disposed to act in a particular way should certain circumstances, obtain? So is there am I disposed to going purchasing coffee if I get tired or something like that? Other thing else being equal. And I think the answer is no, right? But you still might want something, right? But you might not be disposed to getting that thing. Putting two and two together, not putting the beliefs about acting and desiring together is something that's kind of going on with the weather watchers then. The weather watchers are constitutionally incapable of action or behavior. They may be said that it might be the case that they're disposed to becoming disposed to act or behave in particular ways if certain conditions are met, right? If they form particular beliefs and different things like that. And these beliefs are seen to be connected with desires and things like that. But it doesn't follow that they're actually disposed to act in any particular way now, just in virtue of having a desire or even having a belief. Because you could have these beliefs, you could have these desires, and not see how they're connected to each other. And if you're unable to see how these beliefs and desires are connected to each other, then you're not going to be disposed to acting in a particular way, while nonetheless you might be disposed to becoming disposed. But that's not too informative because in a lot of ways we're disposed to becoming disposed with regard to almost anything. If someone is now disposed to act in a particular way, say phi, then some proposition would be necessary, right? So consider the condition C. B, some person is now such that if Q were to happen, then B would perform or attempt to perform an action of a particular kind, or would behave or attempt to behave in that particular way. The thing is that if Q were to happen, there are limits to what can fill in that variable there that we can replace the Q, such that the weather watchers are not correctly say to be disposed to act in any way, even though they have beliefs and desires. So imagine these different cases. So A wants badly to get gas for a car, so she now has a property that if she were to see an accessible gas station, she would drive to it, other things being equal. She is now disposed to act or behave in a particular way, where the Q antecedent is if she sees an accessible gas station, right? So if she sees a gas station, then she'll do this. So imagine case 2. B has become completely paralyzed, but does not know it. He wants an orange, and there is one on the table. She hasn't noticed. It is now true of him that if he were to notice the orange, he would attempt to reach it out and take it, although nothing would happen in the way of large-scale bodily movements. In this case, B is now disposed to act or behave in a certain way, and this is so even if he is in fact unable to act or behave observably in any way at all. So here the Q antecedent is B sees an orange on the table. So if he sees an orange, then he'll get that. So the disposition runs that way. So if you look at here, condition C is B is such that if Q were to happen, then B would perform or attempt to perform a particular action. And so B is now disposed to act in a certain way. Phi, then some proposition of this form is true. If Q were to happen, then B would perform phi or attempt to perform phi. So now consider this next case. This is more complicated. D is completely paralyzed and worse off than C, for he used to try to act, to move his body, although he knew he was paralyzed. There used to be something that, for him, constituted trying to do these things. Now, however, he has completely lost contact with his formal experience and capacity for agency, and he finds that there is no longer anything that, for him, constitutes trying to move his body. Even these thoughts just happen in a stream that he cannot direct, but this is not as bad as it might sound, since most of our thoughts are like this anyway. But what might this be like? It resembles the experience many people have when they decide to try to move their ears or something directly, that is not use their hands, or moving their head, and experience nearly all people have when trying to make their hair wave around directly, right? So you're trying to make your hair wave, but you can't, right? You don't even know how to do it. So continuing the case, suppose that in spite of all this, D finds himself coming to think that there may, after all, be a chance of his sighing, of his moving his body in a certain way. He may then find himself intending to phi, where phi is trying to sigh. So you might find himself trying to get the coffee or something like that, getting up and find himself intending to get up, where where doing this, trying to get up, is doing that action, trying to get up, is also trying to grab the coffee or something like that. But he will then once again be confronted with perfect blankness, the blankness of there being nothing that for him constitutes trying to do this. The blank is so complete that it is not even true to say there is something that constitutes trying to do that, and so on. So if I'm trying to move my hair around, I won't even know how to move my hair around, right? I don't even have any sort of conception of how that would work. Don't even have have no notion about how that would work, and I don't even know what would constitute that, and I don't think my body is constituted for doing that. He cannot act at all, act in any way at all. For the Q antecedent is 1, that D comes to feel that there may, after all, be a chance of phi that is trying to phi or psi. But the relevant condition C is false, given the Q antecedent. So D comes to feel that there may, after all, be a chance of his doing this action, but he can't, right? As things are, it is not true that if Q were to happen, then other things being equal, D would perform or attempt to perform that type of action, because he is unable to attempt to perform it. He doesn't have any conception of it. Just like I am unable to attempt to wiggle my hair around my head, right, directly. I can't even attempt that, right? It's not something that I can attempt to do. For what will happen when what will happen then when Q happens in his way is nothing at all, right? He doesn't know how to do it. So if conditional C comes out to be true in this case, then Q has to be expanded a lot. So conditional C is something like this, if Q were to happen, then other things being equal, B would perform or attempt to perform an action of kind phi. So if Q were to happen, then B would perform or attempt to perform an action kind phi, or behave or attempt to behave in a way phi. And so this is important to note. If Q were to happen, then other things being equal, B would perform or attempt to perform an action kind phi. The thing is that if C conditional turns out to be true in one of these cases, or in this last case at least, in Q, if Q were to happen, then B would perform or attempt to perform phi. Would have to be expanded significantly. It would have to be expanded significantly that would take us over a crucial type of line. So to the original antecedent Q is 1. D comes to feel that there might be something after all, a chance of him phi. So you have that part, the number 1 part, right? So the original antecedent Q is, it feels that there might be something after all that would be a chance of performing this action. You have to add this second part, that D comes to be such that there is once again something that for him constitutes trying to do this thing, and so comes to be such that he is once again able to act in some way. But if you allow that we're able to act in a particular way, then you've crossed the line. The idea is that you've already assumed then that they are intentional agents. There are intentional actors in the world, people doing particular things intentionally. So if you are adding 2 in, then you're already assuming that they're intentional agents. But the Q antecedents are occurrences of such a kind. When they occur, beings that are already intentional agents then will perform or attempt to form those particular action kinds. So that's just, it's amounting to sort of begging the question, saying that if we add this stuff into if Q were to happen, then you would act in this way, right? If you add to that 2, D comes to be such that if there is again something that for him constitutes trying to psi, and so comes to be such that he is once again able to act in some way, then this is just to put in the antecedent Q, that is, that he is an intentional actor. So if you say if Q were to happen, if he was an intentional actor, then he would perform or attempt to perform some sort of action kind phi. But that's just to admit that he's an intentional actor, which is just to beg the question against the weather watchers. With addition of this number 2 to 1, then, in this last substitution for Q, nothing less than is the acquisition of the ability to act in some way, and it's including intentionality in the antecedent. But this allows too much, right? This is, like I said, begging a question. And it also is a consequence that everything is disposed to act or behave in a particular way, right? Anything is. So if you're saying that, so this, my coffee cup, right, can act in a particular way if it becomes situated such that it feels like something can happen. If the acquisition of the ability to act or behave can get into any Q antecedent, then anything is disposed to act in a particular way. But we don't want to say that anything is to act in a particular way. So he says, now returning to D, we get the conclusion that he is not now disposed to act or behave in any way, even though he has beliefs and desires, and even though he could relatively easily be turned into something that was disposed to act or behave in a particular way. There are 2 ways of underpinning the idea that a radically incapacitated human being like D is no longer disposed to act or behave in any way. So the first way involves the idea that there are fundamental physiological and neurophysiological reasons why there's nothing for him to constitute acting or trying to act in a particular way. The second way involves the idea of primary obstacle of D's action is this like unshakable conviction that there's nothing for him to do. So in that way, there's nothing. D is no longer disposed to act in a way because he doesn't see himself being able to do that. So one could say here that there are things that he would like to do, things that he would like to be able to do, and he would do them if he could. but he is not now disposed to act in any way, and that the fact that he has these desires for action makes no difference in his incapacity, right? So now imagine a different case. Case E. Consider E, whose situation is identical to D's in current relevant respects, except for the fact that she has evolved successfully into her paralyzed state. She indulges in no wishful thinking and has no trace of any desire for what she knows would be impossible. She still wants certain things, the sun to shine, for example, but she um, no longer wishes to bring anything about. She has um, put against the past, her past behind her, but we find the case of E hard to imagine, right? Our convictions about human nature strongly impede our imagination and encourage us to slip back into thinking that it is, after all, a necessary truth that to want something is to, in fact, be disposed to bringing something about. Uh, so the trouble here is that it's not the case that this is impossible. It's that we are actors, that we, as humans, we act, right? Are we act all the time, and it's hard for us to imagine someone like this. But it doesn't mean it's impossible. And it doesn't mean that desires are necessarily connected to actions either. Another thing that uh, he wants to say is that not just anything could go into the antecedent position of a C conditional. If anything could, such as say Q4. So if Q4 were in coming to be capable of acting, it could come to be capable in particular of fine, or at least trying to fine. Or Q5. So Q5 could be something like had a strong desire to interfere with the weather and so on. Then other things being equal, W would phi or tempt to phi. So if these things are possible, these sort of conditions are possible, then anything is possible. To say that W is now necessarily disposed to act in certain ways because of the truth of this conditional is like saying that a lump of plastic is now disposed to conduct electricity because its constituent parts could be reorganized to constitute gold. Um, so remember Q is that if Q were to happen, then other things being equal, B would perform or attempt to perform an action kind phi. So Q4 could be something like if Q4 were in coming to be capable of action to come to be capable in particular of phi, or at least trying to phi, or Q5 had if someone has no stronger desire not to interfere with the weather and so on, then other things being equal, W would phi or tempt to phi. So these types of things, and you could look at the other Qs that he has set up there. But if you can just add anything into this if Q were to happen, then anything could be permissible, and anything could be um, could conduct electricity or whatever. You know, this lump of plastic is now disposed to conduct electricity because it could be reorganized into gold. This table that I'm sitting at could be restructured to talk to me, right? If its structure was reorganized and things like that. And so, you know, we don't want to say anything is possible in that respect. To say that there aren't informative truths that can be put in conditional ways that link desires to action kind descriptions. So consider this next statement. If Bing B1 had desire D, believed that there was something it could do about satisfying D, believed in particular that phi was the best or the only way to satisfy D, believed itself able to do this phi, had no equally strong or stronger countervailing desire, D prime, that it believed it could do something about. 6, was in fact capable of action, 7, was more particularly able to fly, or was at least capable of trying to fly, then, everything else being equal, 8, B would fly or attempt to fly. And so you have this really long conditional statement that actually seems to be correct with regard to being a necessary truth about linking desire descriptions with action descriptions. But this doesn't give you any grounds to say that the weather watchers have any sort of disposition to behave, right? So the fact that such conditionals would be true doesn't give any grounds for an objection to the weather watchers, who may fulfill 1 and 5, but may or may not fulfill 3, depending on whether or not they have the consumption action, but do not fulfill 2, 4, 6, and 7. So it'd be unwarranted to say that they don't really have certain dispositions to action or behavior because of the truth of conditional in this form. So it's only that specific combinations of beliefs and desires will dispose one to action. Here, you can't say that the weather watchers are disposed to any sort of action because they don't have the relevant beliefs combined to their desires. An agent's not necessarily supposed to act in any way simply because it has a particular desire. The property that a mental state like desiring has of being apt to cause certain sorts of behavior is not one that the desire has in isolation. So if you think of desire on the one hand and beliefs on the other hand, you can think about what a belief is and what a desire is. A desire, you can ask, what are the intrinsic traits of the desire? What are the intrinsic attributes of the desire? And what is one of them being apt to cause certain sorts of behavior? It doesn't seem like it, because you have to actually add something to the desire in order for you to be disposed to behaving in a particular way. It's apt to cause certain sorts of behaviors when it's combined with certain particular types of beliefs. And this should give you reason to think that the action or the dispositional theory is missing something or is incomplete. So if I do have belief combined with the desire, then I will be disposed to act in a particular way. But this doesn't mean that I'm now disposed to act in a particular way just because I have that particular desire. So oxygen obviously is apt to, in certain circumstances, when it's combined with other things, to quench thirst for human beings who ingest it, or to kill human beings who ingest it. It's also apt for causing the existence of flames that leap higher and higher, and suitably combined with other things for quenching the flames, right? Beliefs and desires are like this in relation to action and behavior. So oxygen can be lots of different things, but it's not as if it's essential to oxygen that it is able to be ingested, or that it will kill you, or that it will quench flames or cause flames, right? So it's something that when combined with other things, it does the same. That's an analogy that Strawson's making with regard to beliefs and desires. He says, given their already existing and independently graspable nature, they can enter into combinations in which they may be said to constitute dispositions for action and behavior. But this fact is in no tension with the fact that things like weather watchers can have beliefs and desires and not be disposed to act in a particular way. So if someone doesn't know about behavior, it doesn't mean that there's any sort of inadequacy in one's notion of desire or having a desire. For us, though, I mean, it might be true that a sign of wanting is trying to get. A primitive sign of wanting is trying to get, like Anscombe says. But this doesn't follow that one has to know about behavior to know what a desire is. It seems like you can want something without wanting to get it, even though that might typically be true of us, right? Because we're action-oriented beings. But if something is constitutionally significantly different from us, then there's no reason to think that it has to have the same primitive sides of wanting that we do. So one may want to grant the property that oxygen has of being disposed to combine with carbon or uranium in the way that it does is partly constitutive of the essential nature of oxygen. That's fine. But this property specified in this way is not constitutive of the nature of oxygen in such a way that you cannot possibly be said to know the nature of oxygen without knowing the nature of carbon or uranium, and knowing that oxygen combines with it in the way it does. Similarly, the property that any desire has of being essentially suited to combine with beliefs in such a way as to constitute disposition to act or behave is not a property that you would have to know about under this description in order to know or say what a desire is. So you can know what oxygen is without knowing about carbon or uranium, just like you can know what a desire is without knowing specific beliefs or actions are. The weather watchers then can long for rain, but have no conception of the possibility of action or behavior. So what it is to desire or want something or like something, this is fundamental to the sense of it knows what desire is. So if I'm desiring something, then I want it or like it. And that's the fun in Strawson's translate, this is fundamental to having a desire. So being conscious of it and liking it is fundamental. The primary linkage of the notion of desire is to the notion other than itself, is not to the notion of action or behavior. So if we have to combine the notion of liking to something else, then it's going to be combined with something that's not an action or behavior. Rather, though, it's a notion of being pleased or happy or contented should something come about, and to the distinct but correlative notion of being unhappy or discontented should not come about. This is the most similar attribute to desire is liking or enjoyment or pleasure, and not action, right? And so this is more similar. The primary linking to another notion is of pleasure or being happy or enjoyment, and frustration when it's not satisfied. Further, it seems that affect is intimately connected with desire. The connection between desire and pleasure um, is more intimate, he thinks, than action, but it does seem in some respects so that if you can say, look, action and desire are breakable, it seems that action and pleasure is also breakable. Why I think that if you are disposed to feeling pleasure when you get such and such, then you desire such and such. It seems that you could remove that cue there, right? Just like you remove the cues from the action conditionals. But desire, he says, is more fundamental. When you desire and pleasure connection is more fundamental. When your desires fulfill, you are satisfied, and when it's not, you're frustrated. Pleasure is the fulfillment of a want, and it may be annihilated by misfortune. And the moment of satisfaction of a want might be the moment in which one discovers that what one, in fact, that it wasn't what one wanted, right? So say you think you want something particular, like a particular job, you get it, and you're not satisfied, you realize actually that isn't what I wanted. I thought I wanted that, but I wanted something else. I thought this would give me something else, when in fact it doesn't. So he says, imagine this other group, right? And they don't have any affective states at all, any emotions or these types of things. But he says they are capable of entering these types of things called M states, which are like dispose them to act in particular ways. And these are motivational states, and these are similar to what we normally think of a desiring state. So you're disposed to act in a particular way. Specific M states in combination with specific informational states lead to movements, he says. He wants to know if M states are desires or not. He says some might hold that M states should be counted as desire states given their motivational role, even though this group of people never feel any sort of pleasure or displeasure on the account of having brought about what they brought about. Others, however, think that it's not a general truth that states that combine with informational states to motivate behavior are desire states. Strawson thinks that these aren't, right? These aren't desires. He says M states can exist in completely experienceless beings, and that being such that can never be truly said to have a desire. So Strawson thinks then that one, desires are cautious episodes, and two, desires are most similar to pleasure, and so they can't just be mere dispositions behave because those are unconscious, and so dispositions behave can't be had in experienceless beings, and like robots or something. But you wouldn't want to say that they want something, right? This is not because desires or pro-attitudes themselves are necessarily experience involving. He says they're not, but in some ways he actually claims that they are. So he thinks that there are states like standing desires and occurrent desires. For occurrent desires, of course, he thinks that these require experience. Standing desires, though, he's fine with them not. He says, but rather because a being's possession of the capacity for experience is at least a necessary condition of its being such that it can correctly be said to desire things, believing things, hope for things, and understand things. So in this sense, then, it seems as if you do need to be conscious, right? Because he says it's a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition if you have a capacity for experience, or capacity experience is a necessary condition for desiring. So if you desire, then you have a capacity for experience. That's his view there. But you can have a motivational state without having a capacity for experience. So he thinks that motivational states can't be desire states. Then he goes on to say that pleasure seems essential for desire. Nothing could count as a genuine conscious desire of a certain creature utterly incapable of any sort of affective state, like liking or enjoying or particular things like that. And he thinks this reinforces the thought that the primary linkage of the notion of desire to a notion other than itself is the notion of affect, pleasure or displeasure, and not the behavior. Weather watchers, they can have affect, right? But they don't have any disposition to behave in any particular way. They're disposed to having conscious experiences of desiring this or that, but they aren't disposed to behaving in any particular kind of way. So it does seem that desires are important to the nature of action, but an account of action and behavior doesn't give any sort of satisfactory account of desire. I can talk about action and behavior, and it doesn't really not even mention desire. Action and behavior is among many things that can be or become the object of desire, right? So I might want to act, I might want to behave in a particular way. So it could be an object of desire. But I can give a complete account of behavior and it has nothing to do with desire at all. So he gives two cases. So someone who sometimes a being wants Y and believes it can do something X that will bring Y, and hence doing X becomes part of the object of its desire. So I want Y, I want coffee and believe that walking to the coffee shop will get me coffee. So I want to walk to the coffee shop because it will get me coffee, right? Sometimes number two, doing something is the object of a being's desire when it's in its own right rather, and not because it's a means to anything else. So sometimes walking to coffee shop is what I want to do because I really want to walk to the coffee shop. I like that. So why is it then that we think that action is necessary for desire or essential aspect of desire? Why is action so play such a prominent role in our discussions of desire? He says because we live in a planet swarming with agents, a planet on which desires are incessantly involved in the causation of action and behaviors. This is a typical thing, right? Because action is typically connected with behavior, or sorry, action is typically connected with desire, but it doesn't follow from the typical connection of desire and action that action is essential for desire. Desire is more closely connected with affect, with liking, with liking something, than it is with acting in a particular way. He says we might be led to mistake a causal connection for a constitutive connection, or a constitutive connection rather. So we might think that one causes the other, confuse the causal aspect for being part of something. One thing might be a part of another thing, but that it doesn't follow from that this thing is part of the other thing. If one thing causes something else, it doesn't follow from that is part of that thing, right? Fire causes smoke, but it doesn't mean smoke's part of fire. All right, so now consider the weather watchers, right? It has the same desire as we have ourselves. So it also wants to be close to something, and it hopes that that thing will move it closer to it, but it has no capacity for action, and there's nothing that for it constitutes even trying to do something to bring it about. It has no vaguely sensed movement or impulse at all. The weather watcher just wants something. There is no action attached to it at all. So perhaps wanting can cause one to imagine what it would be like if the object were obtained, but it doesn't go to show that it's essential aspect of the wanting to bring something about. In claiming that to want is necessarily be disposed to do, we seem like people who have a perfectly good theory of the elements, and yet assert that there can be no such thing as pure oxygen because they inhabit a planet on which the ambient conditions ensure that oxygen never occurs except in compounds. So just because oxygen isn't always occurs in compounds, it doesn't follow that it's impossible for there to be something called pure oxygen. Just like typically when we desire something, we are disposed to doing something, it doesn't follow from that is the essence of desire. It doesn't always involve the will. I can want Bob to win the tennis match against Sam, but not want to do anything about it. Our constant connection with action spreads itself conceptually onto desire. So we are constantly connected to action in our lives. And because of that, we conceptually spread this action-oriented existence onto our mental states, such as desire. So Strawson's view can be summarized like this. Desires are not essentially connected to actions. You can want something and not be disposed to acting in a particular way. The weather watchers seem to be a case of wanting something and not being able to act in a particular way to bring about, or being even disposed to act in a particular way to bring it about. It's not the case, furthermore, why is it that we think that desire is connected to action in a particular way? It's because we're action-oriented people. But just like oxygen is just because it's usually connected to other things, it doesn't mean that there can't be pure oxygen. Furthermore, desire is more related to affect than it is to behavior or action. And because of that, it seems that if you're going to link it to something else, then you should link it to pleasure or some sort of satisfaction or enjoyment. Pleasure is much more closely related to consciousness and to enjoyment than it is to behavior. In fact, it seems that if you're actually desiring something, for the most part, then you have to be capable of being conscious. So if you're not capable, but the thing is that you can be disposed to act in a particular way and not be capable of being conscious. Because of that, it seems as if then those things being disposed to action and aren't necessarily things that have to be desiring something like that. So, because I can desire something, if I desire something, then I have to be capable of consciousness. So if I'm capable of, if I desire something, I have to be capable of consciousness. And if and desiring seems to be much more closely associated with enjoyment or pleasure than it does with action. And so, if you consider our first line, the definition of desire under this view, I think it will make more sense now. The organism to desire P is for the organism to be disposed to take pleasure in it seeming that P, and displeasure in it seeming that not P. So, for example, if I want pizza, then I'm disposed to take pleasure in seeming that I have pizza. Right? If I want the weather to be nice, then I'm disposed to taking pleasure in the weather being nice and being frustrated the weather isn't nice. But this doesn't entail me wanting to try to do anything about the weather being nice. Right? I want it to be nice without trying to take any sort of action into making it be nice.